For 12 long years, a loyal dog waited outside the hospital doors, refusing to leave. Through rain, snow, and scorching heat, he stood guard, his eyes locked on the entrance, waiting for the soldier who never came back. People tried to take him in, but he wouldn't budge. Until one day, a stranger uncovered the truth, and what happened next left an entire town in tears. What was this dog waiting for? And could the unthinkable really happen after all this time? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road as Tom Willis guided his pickup truck through familiar streets, grocery bags rustling in the back. His black Labrador, Duke, sat contentedly in the passenger seat, his head tilted toward the open window. The warm spring breeze ruffled Duke's fur as his tongue lolled out in pure canine joy. Tom glanced over at his faithful companion and couldn't help but smile. "Living your best life there, buddy." He reached over to scratch behind Duke's ears, earning an appreciative tail thump against the seat. The truck's radio played softly in the background as they turned onto Oak Street, the route they'd taken hundreds of times before. Duke's ears perked up as they passed the park, where they often stopped for their evening walks. Everything changed in an instant. A blue sedan burst through the red light, its driver's face illuminated by the glow of a cell phone. Tom's military reflexes kicked in as he yanked the wheel hard to the right, but the truck's tires lost their grip on the asphalt. The world spun in a sickening blur of colors and sounds. The screech of metal, the shattering of glass, Duke's startled yelp. The truck slammed into a lamppost with bone-jarring force before rolling onto its side. Duke was thrown through the open window, landing hard on the pavement several yards away. The Labrador struggled to his feet, favoring his left front leg, but driven by desperate concern for his master. Duke limped toward the smoking wreckage, whining as he caught the metallic scent of blood. Through the spider-webbed windshield, he could see Tom slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Duke barked urgently, circling the truck and pawing at the driver's side door, trying to reach Tom. Other cars had stopped, their drivers emerging with phones in hand, voices raised in alarm. The ambulance arrived in a flash of red and white lights. Paramedics jumped out, their movements quick but precise as they assessed the situation. They worked to stabilize Tom's neck and spine before carefully extracting him from the crumpled truck. "Male, mid-40s, unconscious but breathing," one paramedic called out as they transferred Tom onto a stretcher. "Possible head trauma and internal injuries." Duke followed close behind as they wheeled Tom toward the ambulance, his injured leg forgotten in his determination to stay with his human. When they lifted the stretcher into the vehicle, Duke tried to jump in after them, barking frantically, his eyes fixed on Tom's still face. "Sorry, boy," a paramedic said softly, gently pushing Duke back. "You can't come with us." The doors closed with a decisive click. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens piercing the evening air, Duke's protective instincts took over. Ignoring the pain in his leg, he sprinted after the flashing lights, his powerful legs carrying him down the street. His heart pounded with each stride as he chased the ambulance into the gathering darkness, refusing to let Tom out of his sight. Duke's paws scraped against the pavement as he finally reached the VA hospital, his chest heaving from the long run. The familiar antiseptic smell mixed with medicine wafted through the automatic doors each time they slid open. His dark eyes darted between the steady stream of doctors and nurses rushing in and out, searching for any sign of Tom. Finding a spot near the emergency entrance, Duke settled down, his injured leg tucked carefully beneath him. His ears remained alert, twitching at every sound, while his gaze stayed fixed on the sliding doors. Each time they opened, his head lifted hopefully, only to sink back down when Tom wasn't among those passing through. Inside the hospital's stark white corridors, a team of doctors worked frantically over Tom's unconscious form. The initial assessment had revealed more severe injuries than they'd first suspected, internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. Monitors beeped urgently as they rushed him to the operating room. "Blood pressure's dropping," one doctor called out. "We need to move fast." Hours passed as the surgical team worked to repair the damage. Outside, the sun set and rose again, but Duke remained at his post. His fur grew damp with morning dew, yet he refused to seek shelter. Hospital staff began to notice the black lab sitting stoically by the entrance, his tail thumping hopefully whenever someone in scrubs emerged from the building. After the surgery, Tom was moved to the ICU, still unconscious and connected to various machines. Meanwhile, Duke's vigilance never wavered. When people approached to offer help, he would accept water gratefully, but wouldn't move from his chosen spot. His eyes remained locked on those sliding doors, waiting for the one person he needed to see. As evening approached again, a nurse named Sarah stepped out for her break. She noticed Duke sitting there, just as he had been when she'd arrived for her shift that morning. His fur was slightly matted, and he looked tired, but his posture remained alert and watchful. Sarah crouched down beside him, unwrapping her sandwich. "Hey there, sweet boy," she said softly. "You must be hungry." Duke's nose twitched at the smell of food, but his eyes stayed focused on the hospital entrance. Sarah tore off half of her turkey sandwich and held it out to him. After a moment's hesitation, Duke gently took the offering, chewing it slowly before returning to his watch. "You're waiting for someone special, aren't you?" Sarah asked, studying the dog's unwavering dedication. She sighed as she watched him maintain his steadfast vigil, touched by his simple yet powerful display of loyalty. 3 days stretched into a blur of comings and goings at the VA hospital entrance. Duke remained steadfast at his post, his black fur collecting dust from the constant flow of traffic. The hospital staff had begun to recognize him, sharing concerned glances as they passed. Some brought him water in paper cups, while others snuck him bits of their lunch. "That dog hasn't moved since Tuesday," one nurse whispered to another as they walked past. A security guard approached Duke, waving his hands. "Go on, get out of here. This is a hospital, not a kennel." But before he could shoo Duke away, a group of veterans in wheelchairs rolled up to the entrance. One of them, an elderly man with silver hair, spoke up firmly. "Leave him be. He's one of ours." "Sir, we can't have strays hanging around," the guard protested. Another veteran, wearing a Marine Corps cap, shook his head. "That's no stray. Look at his eyes. He's waiting for someone. That's a soldier's dog if I ever saw one." Inside the hospital, Tom's condition took an unexpected turn. His brain activity had become erratic, and complications from the surgery were causing concern among his medical team. Dr. Martinez frowned at the monitors. "His neural responses are concerning. We need to transfer him to the Peterson Institute. They specialize in these cases." The paperwork moved quickly through the system. A clerk rushing through end-of-shift duties processed the transfer forms. In her haste, she checked the wrong box, marking Tom's file as non-returning patient instead of temporary transfer. That box, so small on the form, would make all the difference in how the hospital handled Tom's departure. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, 2 paramedics wheeled Tom's unconscious form out through a side entrance. The ambulance's lights remained off to avoid disturbing other patients. Inside the vehicle, machines beeped steadily as they monitored Tom's vital signs. No one thought to tell the staff about the loyal Labrador at the main entrance. No one remembered to inform the veterans who had defended him. And no one noticed Duke's tail droop slightly as another day began without Tom. Duke remained at his post, his dark eyes fixed on the sliding doors. His fur had collected a fine layer of morning dew, but he didn't shake it off. He simply waited, as he had done for days, for the moment when Tom would walk through those doors again. A young nurse walked past, placing a fresh bowl of water near him. "Still here, buddy?" she said softly, but Duke barely acknowledged her. His focus never wavered from the entrance, watching, waiting, hoping for the one face he longed to see. A week crept by, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun over the VA hospital's concrete facade. Duke had become a fixture at the entrance, as constant as the automatic doors that whooshed open and closed throughout the day. His black coat had grown dusty, but his eyes remained bright and alert, watching every person who entered or left. Hospital staff and visitors had taken to leaving food for him: half-eaten sandwiches, protein bars, and even proper dog food that some brought from home. Duke would eat just enough to keep his strength up, never straying more than a few feet from his post. Every morning at precisely 9 a.m., George Martinez, a Vietnam veteran who walked with a slight limp, would settle onto the bench next to Duke with his coffee and newspaper. He understood the depth of the bond between a soldier and his dog, having lost his own service companion years ago. "You're a good boy," George would say, his voice rough with emotion. "Faithful till the end, just like my old scout was." Duke would briefly rest his head on George's knee, accepting the gentle pat, before returning his vigilant watch on the doors. One sunny afternoon, a young couple with 2 children stopped to pet Duke. The woman's eyes filled with concern as she noticed his unwavering focus on the hospital entrance. "He needs a home," she told her husband. "We can't just leave him here." They returned the next day with a leash and collar, approaching Duke with gentle words and treats. The woman managed to slip the collar around his neck, but the moment they tried to lead him away from the entrance, Duke's entire demeanor changed. He planted his paws firmly on the ground, his body going rigid. A low whine escaped his throat as he pulled backward, straining against the leash. The more they tried to coax him forward, the more distressed he became, his eyes never leaving the glass doors. "Look at him," the husband said softly. "He's not ready to leave." The woman unclipped the leash, watching as Duke immediately returned to his spot, settling down with a quiet determination that brought tears to her eyes. Word of Duke's dedication spread through the hospital. Nurses began calling him the guardian of Ward A, sharing his story with new staff members and patients. Some would sit with him during their breaks, speaking to him in soft voices about their own lives and losses. "That dog's got more loyalty in his little toe than most humans have in their whole body," one nurse commented to another as they watched him from inside. On a particularly quiet evening, Dr. Thompson, who had been following Duke's vigil since the beginning, finally stepped outside. The elderly doctor's face was lined with compassion as he knelt in front of the faithful Labrador. Duke's ears perked up slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the entrance. "He's not coming back, buddy," Dr. Thompson whispered, gently stroking Duke's head. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning, but they made no difference to Duke. His gaze remained steadfast, focused on the sliding glass doors, waiting for the return of the only person who mattered to him. The first snowflakes of winter drifted down from a pearl gray sky, coating the hospital grounds in a delicate white blanket. Duke lay curled up against the cold pavement near the entrance, his black fur collecting tiny crystals of snow. His breath came out in small puffs of steam as he maintained his endless vigil. Inside the warm lobby, Officer Mike Jensen watched through the glass doors, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd been working security at the VA hospital for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. The sight of the loyal dog made his throat tight with emotion. "Still out there, huh?" asked another guard passing by with his clipboard. "Always is," Mike replied softly, taking another sip of his lukewarm coffee. The automatic doors whooshed open as Olivia Carter hurried out, her arms full. She carried an old fleece blanket from the hospital's storage room and a plastic bowl of warm chicken broth she'd brought from home. The young nurse had been watching Duke for weeks now, her heart breaking a little more each day. Kneeling beside him, Olivia carefully spread the blanket over Duke's back. The dog lifted his head slightly, acknowledging her presence with gentle eyes, before returning his gaze to the entrance. She set the bowl of broth near his nose, the steam rising in the cold air. "You really think he's coming back, don't you?" she whispered, running her hand along his snow-dusted fur. Duke's only response was to perk up as the doors slid open again, his tail wagging hopefully before dropping back to the ground when he saw it wasn't Tom. Later that afternoon, Ms. Peterson, one of the hospital administrators, strode through the lobby with a determined look on her face. "This has gone on long enough," she announced to the staff at the front desk. "We can't have a stray dog hanging around the entrance. It's a liability issue. I'm calling animal control." Her words carried across the lobby to where several veterans were gathered for their weekly support group. George Martinez stood up from his chair, leaning on his cane as he approached the administrator. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "Duke's not a stray. He's one of us." Other veterans joined him, forming a protective circle. "That dog's got more right to be here than half the people who walk through these doors," added another veteran, his voice gruff with emotion. "He's not causing any trouble," Olivia chimed in, stepping forward. "He's gentle with everyone, and the patients love him. Some of them say seeing his dedication helps them keep going with their own treatments." Ms. Peterson looked from face to face, her expression softening slightly. She sighed, adjusting her glasses. "Fine. He can stay, but only if he doesn't become a disruption, and someone needs to take responsibility for him." "We'll look after him," George said immediately, the other veterans nodding in agreement. "He's family now." "He's a veteran's dog," another added. "That makes him one of our own." Ms. Peterson nodded curtly and walked away. The veterans gathered near the entrance, looking out at Duke through the glass. The snow was falling harder now, but the loyal dog remained at his post, the blanket Olivia had brought still draped across his back. "Don't worry, boy," George murmured, pressing his hand against the cold glass. "We've got your back now." The winter wind whipped through the hospital parking lot as a white van with Second Chance Animal Rescue, painted on its side, pulled up near the entrance. Two women in navy blue uniforms stepped out, their faces pinched with concern as they spotted Duke in his usual spot. "That's him," said the taller woman, Sarah, clutching a leash in her gloved hands. "Poor thing's been out here for months now." Her colleague, Beth, pulled out a bag of premium treats from her pocket. "We can't let him stay here through winter. He'll freeze to death." They approached Duke slowly, speaking in soft, encouraging voices. Duke lifted his head, his brown eyes wary but gentle. Sarah crouched beside him, offering a treat while Beth moved to his other side with the leash. "Come on, sweet boy," Sarah coaxed. "We'll find you a nice, warm home." Duke sniffed the treat but didn't take it. When Beth tried to slip the leash around his neck, he backed away, pressing himself against the wall. His eyes remained fixed on the hospital doors. "Maybe if we both lift him?" Beth suggested. They made several attempts to guide Duke toward the van, but each time he dug his paws into the pavement, his body becoming dead weight. His whines grew more desperate as they pulled him further from his post. Finally, after 20 minutes of gentle coaxing and careful maneuvering, they managed to lift Duke into the van. He immediately pressed his nose against the window, ears flat against his head, watching the hospital entrance grow smaller as they drove away. At the shelter, Duke was given a spacious kennel with a soft bed and plenty of blankets. Volunteers brought him premium food and fresh water, but the bowls remained untouched. Hour after hour, he sat by the kennel door, staring at the exit with the same unwavering focus he'd shown at the hospital. Days passed. Duke grew listless, his usual gentle alertness replaced by a deep sadness. He wouldn't play with toys or interact with other dogs. The shelter staff tried everything: special treats, long walks, even bringing in a professional trainer. But nothing could lift Duke's spirits. On the fourth day, the shelter director, Marion, picked up the phone and dialed the hospital's number. "Is this Nurse Carter? This is Marion from Second Chance Rescue. I think we made a mistake with Duke." That evening, Olivia's car pulled up to the shelter. The moment Duke saw her, his ears perked up slightly, the first reaction he'd shown in days. She knelt beside him, running her hands through his fur. "Let's get you home, boy," she whispered. The drive back to the hospital was quick. As they approached the familiar building with its glowing entrance, Duke's entire demeanor changed. His tail began to wag, thumping against the car seat. When Olivia opened the door, he jumped out and trotted straight to his usual spot by the entrance. Duke turned in a circle twice before settling down, his eyes immediately locking onto the sliding glass doors. His tail still wagged gently as he resumed his post, as if he'd never left at all. The years changed, painting the hospital grounds in different colors, but Duke remained constant. His golden fur gradually showed touches of gray around his muzzle, yet his post by the entrance never wavered. He became as much a part of the hospital as the brick walls and sliding glass doors. Early morning visitors would find him alert and watchful. "Good morning, Duke," they'd call out, and his tail would thump against the concrete in response. Some dropped off breakfast sandwiches, others stopped to share their coffee breaks with him. A group of veterans who visited the hospital regularly made Duke part of their routine. They'd gather near him, sharing stories of their own service dogs. "Had one just like him in Afghanistan," one would say, scratching Duke's ears. "Same loyal heart." Duke listened to their stories with patient attention, accepting their gentle pets, but his eyes always returned to the doors. Every time they slid open, his ears would perk up, hopefully. On a crisp autumn morning, a young woman with a notepad approached Duke. She crouched beside him, watching as he interacted with passing patients. Some would stop to pet him, their tense shoulders relaxing as they ran their hands through his fur. Others would pause in their wheelchairs, finding comfort in his calm presence. The journalist spent hours observing Duke, taking notes and interviewing hospital staff. Her article, "The Dog Who Never Left," appeared in the local paper the following week. The story spread quickly, touching hearts across the city. Soon, people began making special trips just to see Duke. They brought homemade treats, new blankets, and toys. Some left notes tied with ribbons to the nearby bench. "You're an inspiration, Duke, and keep the faith, boy." A local artist, moved by Duke's story, approached the hospital administration with a proposal. With their approval, she spent a week painting a mural on the wall near Duke's spot. The image showed Duke sitting faithfully by the door, his form cast in warm, gentle colors. Above him, in elegant script, were the words, "Some bonds never break." Duke watched the artist work with mild interest, accepting the occasional pat on his head, but never straying from his vigil. The growing attention didn't change his routine. Whether surrounded by admirers or alone in the quiet hours of night, his focus remained unchanged. Olivia made sure to spend time with him during her breaks. She'd bring him fresh water and sit beside him on the ground, not minding the dirt on her scrubs. Sometimes she'd talk to him about her day, about the patients she'd helped, or about nothing in particular. One evening, as the sun set behind the hospital building, Olivia settled next to Duke with her dinner. She broke her sandwich in half, offering him a piece which he gently accepted. His gray-flecked muzzle rested on his paws as she scratched behind his ears. He'd be proud of you, you know, she whispered, watching Duke's eyes track the movement of the doors. Duke leaned into her touch, accepting the comfort, but his gaze never wavered from its eternal watch. In a small room at Riverside Care Center, Tom Willis sat in his worn armchair, gazing out the window at the passing clouds. His weathered hands rested on the armrests, fingers occasionally tapping an absent rhythm. The world outside felt distant, like watching a movie he couldn't quite follow. At 72, Tom's days blurred together in a gentle haze. Sometimes he'd catch himself searching for something, a memory, a feeling, a connection that danced just beyond his reach. During meals, he'd occasionally save a bit of his dinner roll, though he never knew why. The nurses would find the pieces later, tucked away in his pocket. Something's missing, he'd mumble sometimes, patting his chest where an unexplained ache lived. Can't remember what, but something's not right. Eric Sullivan, a fresh-faced physical therapist, noticed Tom's distant stares during their weekly sessions. While other patients chatted about their families or their past lives, Tom remained quiet, as if the stories of his life were locked away in a box he couldn't open. One afternoon, after helping Tom with his exercises, Eric stayed behind to review his patient files. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he flipped through the yellowed pages of Tom's medical history. The transfer papers from years ago mentioned a severe accident, a coma, and complications that led to memory loss. But something caught Eric's eye, a note scribbled in the margins of an old evaluation. Patient occasionally calls out for Duke in his sleep. Eric frowned, scanning the family contact section. It was empty. No wife, no children, no next of kin. Just that mysterious name, Duke. Eric's curiosity led him to the facility's old records room. Dust particles danced in the beam of his phone's flashlight as he searched through boxes of archived newspapers. His persistence paid off when he found a stack of local papers from several years ago. There, in faded ink, was a story that made his heart skip. The Dog Who Never Left, a tale of unbreakable loyalty. The article showed a photograph of a golden Labrador sitting faithfully outside a VA hospital, waiting for an owner who never returned. With trembling hands, Eric printed a fresh copy of the article. He hurried down the quiet hallway to Tom's room, where the elderly veteran sat in his usual spot by the window. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor as Eric approached. "Mr. Willis," Eric said softly, laying the printed article in Tom's lap. "I found something you might want to see." Tom's age-spotted hands moved slowly over the paper. His eyes, usually clouded with confusion, focused on the headline. Then they moved to the photograph of the patient dog, sitting loyally by the hospital doors. Something shifted in Tom's expression. His fingers traced the outline of the dog in the picture, and his breathing quickened. Like a key turning in a rusty lock, something deep within him began to stir. "Duke," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a long-forgotten prayer. Tom's weathered fingers trembled as they traced the outline of the Labrador in the newspaper photograph. The image showed a loyal dog sitting outside the VA hospital's glass doors, his eyes fixed on the entrance with unwavering dedication. Something about those patient eyes made Tom's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "This dog," Tom mumbled, his voice thick with confusion. "He's been waiting all this time." Eric pulled up a chair beside Tom's armchair, speaking in gentle tones. "According to the article, he's been there for years, never leaves his post." He watched Tom carefully, noting how the elderly veteran's eyes never left the photograph. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room as Tom struggled to make sense of the feelings washing over him. It was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The memories were there, but they slipped away whenever he reached for them. "Sometimes," Eric said, leaning forward, "our hearts remember what our minds forget." What does this picture make you feel, Mr. Willis? Tom's hand pressed against his chest, where that familiar ache lived. Warm, he said slowly. Safe. Like coming home after a long day. His brow furrowed with concentration. But I can't remember why. Do you know this dog? Eric asked carefully, watching Tom's face for any sign of recognition. Tom shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. I don't know. His fingers continued to trace the dog's outline in the photograph. But I feel like I should. It's right there, just out of reach. That night, Tom lay in his narrow bed, the newspaper article resting on his nightstand. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting silver patterns on the wall. Sleep eluded him as his mind churned with half-formed thoughts and feelings. As he drifted in that space between waking and sleeping, images began to flash through his mind. The feel of warm fur beneath his palm, the sound of excited barking echoing in his ears, the gentle sway of a truck on a familiar road. Tom's eyes opened in the darkness, his heart beating faster. The memories felt like photographs scattered in the wind, glimpses of a life he once knew but couldn't quite grasp. He turned his head toward the window, where the moon hung like a silent witness to his struggle. Duke, he whispered into the quiet room, the name feeling both strange and familiar on his tongue. Something about saying it aloud made his chest ache even more, like his heart recognized what his mind couldn't yet remember. Eric couldn't sleep that night. The image of Tom's weathered hands trembling over Duke's photograph haunted him. Something about this case didn't add up. The missing records, the unexplained transfer, the dog who never gave up. He sat at his desk at home, surrounded by photocopied files and old hospital documents, his coffee growing cold beside him. There has to be more, he muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. The morning light was just beginning to peek through his blinds when he decided to make one more trip to the hospital archives. The basement of the administrative building was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Eric pulled box after box from dusty shelves, his fingers skimming through yellowed papers. Transfer forms, medical records, incident reports, all fragments of lives changed within these walls. His eyes were burning from hours of reading when something caught his attention. A faded discharge form from 12 years ago, crumpled at the bottom of a box. His heart started racing as he read Tom's name at the top. No way, he whispered, scanning the document. The details matched. The date of the accident, the coma, the transfer to long-term care. But there, in the corner, was a simple checkbox that changed everything. Someone had marked Tom as a non-returning patient. Eric's hand shook as he pieced it together. The hospital staff would have seen this form. They would have assumed. His stomach dropped as he thought of Duke, still faithfully waiting at those doors, while everyone believed his owner had passed away. He gathered the papers and rushed to the nursing home, barely noticing the morning traffic. When he reached Tom's room, the elderly veteran was sitting in his usual spot by the window, the newspaper article still on his lap. Mr. Willis, Eric said, trying to catch his breath. I found something. He pulled up a chair and spread the documents on the small table between them. You were there, at the VA hospital. After your accident, you were in a coma for months. Tom's eyes widened as Eric continued, his voice gentle but urgent. And that dog, Duke. He never left. He's been waiting for you. For 12 years. The words hung in the air between them. Tom's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. Slowly, a single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, catching the morning light as it fell. At the VA hospital, Olivia knelt beside Duke's warm blanket, her heart heavy as she watched him struggle to his feet. His once golden fur had turned mostly white, and his movements were stiff and careful. She offered him his morning food, but he only took a few listless bites before turning his gaze back to the hospital doors. "Come on, old friend," she whispered, running her hand along his bony spine. "You need to keep your strength up." Dr. Martinez, passing by on his morning rounds, stopped to check on them. "How's he doing today?" Olivia shook her head, fighting back tears. "Not great. He barely touched his breakfast, and yesterday he couldn't even make it to his water bowl without help." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Is this Olivia Carter?" a young man's voice asked. "I'm Eric Sullivan, a physical therapist, and I need to tell you something about Duke." Olivia listened, her free hand clutching Duke's blanket as Eric explained about Tom Willis, alive, remembering, and in a nursing home hours away. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground beside Duke. "He's alive?" she whispered. "All this time?" That afternoon, Olivia called an emergency meeting in the hospital break room. Staff members, veterans, and regular visitors crowded in as she shared the incredible news. The room erupted in a mix of tears and determined voices. "We need to bring him home," declared Mike, a Vietnam veteran who had been visiting Duke for years. "Whatever it takes." They created a fundraising committee on the spot. Sarah from accounting set up an online donation page. The maintenance staff offered to build a welcome banner. Veterans started calling their organizations, spreading the word. The local news caught wind of the story. "Faithful Dog's 12-year wait may finally end," ran as the evening headline. The next morning, 3 different stations showed up to interview Olivia and film Duke at his post. The response was overwhelming. Donations flooded in from across the country. Children emptied their piggy banks. Veterans groups organized fundraising drives. Local businesses pledged matching contributions. Olivia sat with Duke during her breaks, monitoring his declining health while watching the donation total climb. "Just a little longer," she whispered, stroking his thin fur. "Your person is coming home. You just need to hold on a little longer." Duke's tail thumped weakly against his blanket, his faithful eyes never leaving the hospital doors. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ambulance bay as Tom Willis sat in the back of the vehicle, his weathered hands trembling against the newspaper clipping in his lap. Each mile closer to the VA hospital made his heart beat faster, though he couldn't fully understand why. The article's edges had become soft and worn from his constant touching, the image of the loyal dog both familiar and strange. "You doing okay, Mr. Willis?" Eric asked from beside him, watching his patient's nervous movements. Tom nodded, unable to find words. Something deep inside him knew this wasn't just another medical transfer. This meant more. His fingers traced the outline of Duke in the photograph for the 100th time, trying to grasp at memories that floated just out of reach. The ambulance wound through city streets, each turn bringing them closer. Tom's breathing quickened. He could feel it. Something important waited at the end of this journey. The newspaper trembled in his grip as buildings became familiar, though he couldn't say why he recognized them. Finally, the ambulance turned into the hospital entrance. Tom's eyes widened at the crowd gathered outside. Dozens of people standing in the morning light. Hospital staff in scrubs mingled with veterans wearing service caps. Regular folks held up welcome signs, and children bounced on their tiptoes trying to see. At the front of the group, lying on a worn blanket, was an elderly white-faced Labrador. His tired eyes moved slowly across the gathered crowd, while a dark-haired nurse in blue scrubs knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "He's here," Olivia whispered to Duke, her voice catching as she watched the ambulance come to a stop. The back doors opened with a metallic click. Sunlight streamed in as paramedics carefully maneuvered Tom's wheelchair onto the lift. He blinked at the brightness, confused by all the faces turned toward him. Then his gaze dropped to the old dog on the blanket. Time seemed to stop. Tom's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met. Something deep inside his mind cracked open, and memories came rushing back like a flood. The feeling of Duke's puppy fur when he first brought him home, long walks in the park, that final drive to the grocery store, Duke's head hanging out the window in pure joy. His hands gripped the wheelchair arms so tight his knuckles turned white. "Duke?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion and disbelief. The wheelchair rolled forward slowly, each inch bringing Tom closer to the elderly Labrador. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took in Duke's appearance. The strong, energetic dog from his newly recovered memories had been transformed by time. Duke's muzzle was now completely white, his frame thin and fragile beneath fur that had lost its youthful shine. But those eyes, those deep brown eyes that had watched the hospital doors for 12 years, held the same unwavering loyalty they always had. A hush fell over the crowd as Duke's ears perked forward. The old dog's nose twitched, taking in a scent that had been lost to him for so long. With trembling legs, Duke pushed himself up from his blanket. Olivia stayed close, ready to steady him if needed, but the old lab was determined to stand on his own. Duke's paws shuffled forward, each step slow and unsteady. His tail, once so strong and active, moved in gentle sweeps as he approached the wheelchair. Tom's hands shook as he reached out, fingers extended toward his long-lost friend. The moment Tom's fingertips brushed against Duke's soft fur, his mind exploded with memories. Suddenly, he was back in the shelter, watching a clumsy yellow puppy tumble toward him. He remembered Duke chasing tennis balls in their backyard, swimming in the lake during summer vacations, curling up at the foot of his bed during thunderstorms. Every walk, every car ride, every quiet moment they'd shared came flooding back in a rush of emotion that took his breath away. Tears spilled down Tom's weathered cheeks as he looked into his old friend's faithful eyes. "You waited for me, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Duke's tail wagged slowly but surely, his whole body trembling with the effort of standing. Then, mustering his remaining strength, the old dog leaned against Tom's wheelchair. With a soft whimper, he lowered his head into Tom's lap, just as he had done countless times before, and let out a contented sigh. Around them, nurses wiped their eyes with their sleeves. Veterans stood at attention, their own tears falling freely. Children clutched their parents' hands, witnessing a love that had endured beyond all expectations. In that moment, as man and dog reunited after 12 long years, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. The hospital room was quiet, except for the gentle hum of medical equipment and Duke's soft breathing. The old Labrador lay curled up in a plush bed the nurses had brought in, positioned right next to Tom's hospital bed. No one had the heart to separate them, not after 12 years apart. Even Dr. Martinez, known for being strict about hospital protocols, had simply nodded when she saw Duke's bed during her rounds. Tom reached down from his bed, his hand finding Duke's fur in the dim light. The contact seemed to ground him, making the sterile hospital room feel more like home. Every touch brought back another memory, teaching Duke to shake hands, watching him chase butterflies in the park, sharing quiet evenings on the front porch. "Remember when you stole that whole turkey at Thanksgiving?" Tom whispered, scratching behind Duke's ears. The old dog's tail thumped weakly against his bed, his eyes half closed in contentment. As days passed, more memories surfaced. Sometimes they came in fragments: the smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of Duke's collar jingling during their morning walks, the feel of his wet nose pushing against Tom's hand at breakfast time. Other times, Entire scenes would play out in Tom's mind, clear as photographs. Duke rarely left Tom's side, keeping his silent vigil just as he had done outside the hospital for all those years. When Tom dozed off during the day, Duke would rest his head on the edge of the mattress, his watchful eyes moving between his beloved owner and the door. At night, Tom would reach down to stroke Duke's fur until they both fell asleep, each finding comfort in the other's presence. One bright morning, Tom looked out his window at the hospital courtyard below. The spring sunshine spilled across the grass, and small birds hopped between the benches. He turned to Olivia during her morning check-in. "Think we could go outside for a bit?" Olivia smiled, already reaching for the wheelchair beside his bed. "I think that's a wonderful idea." It took some maneuvering. Tom was still weak from his long stay at the nursing home, and Duke moved slowly due to his age. But soon they were heading down the hallway. Duke walked carefully beside the wheelchair, matching Tom's pace just as he had done on thousands of walks before. The courtyard was peaceful, with only the distant sound of traffic beyond the hospital walls. Olivia pushed Tom's wheelchair to a sunny spot near a flowering cherry tree, positioning him so Duke could rest in the shade beside him. The old dog settled down with a contented sigh, pressing against Tom's leg. Looking down at his faithful companion, Tom noticed how the sunlight highlighted the gray around Duke's muzzle, how time had left its mark on them both. He ran his hand along Duke's back, feeling the boniness that hadn't been there in his memories of their younger days. "I guess we're both old now, huh?" Tom said with a gentle laugh. Duke's tail swept slowly across the grass in response, his eyes bright despite his aged face. The morning sun warmed them both as they sat together, making up for all the mornings they had missed. The evening shadows stretched across Tom's hospital room as he watched Duke struggle to his feet. The old Labrador's legs trembled with effort, and his breathing came in slow, labored pants. Tom's heart squeezed painfully in his chest as Duke finally managed to stand, only to sink back down with a soft whimper. "Easy there, boy," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pressed the call button, and within moments, Olivia appeared in the doorway. One look at Duke, and her face fell. "I'll call Dr. Hanson right away," she said softly, referring to the veterinarian who had been checking on Duke regularly since the reunion. While they waited, Tom carefully lowered himself from his bed to sit on the floor beside his friend, his joints protesting the movement. Duke's tail gave a weak thump against the linoleum floor as Tom settled next to him. Dr. Hanson arrived quickly, her kind eyes taking in the scene before her. After a gentle examination, she sat back on her heels and met Tom's worried gaze. "His heart is failing," she said quietly. "He's held on so long, but—" Tom nodded, unable to speak. The news spread quickly through the hospital halls, and soon a steady stream of visitors began appearing at the door. Veterans who had shared their morning coffee with Duke over the years. Nurses who had snuck him treats during their breaks. Even patients who had found comfort in his unwavering presence stopped by to say goodbye. As the sun set, casting orange light through the window, Tom sat in his wheelchair beside Duke's bed. His hand never left Duke's fur as he spoke softly about their shared past. "Remember that camping trip when you chased that squirrel right into the lake?" Tom's voice was gentle, full of love. "You were so proud of yourself, even though you were soaking wet." Duke's tail moved slightly at the sound of Tom's voice. "Or that time you found my keys when I thought I'd lost them forever," Tom continued, his fingers working through Duke's fur. "You always knew exactly what I needed, didn't you, boy?" The hospital staff had brought in extra blankets to make Duke comfortable, and someone had placed his favorite water bowl nearby, though he hadn't touched it. Olivia checked in regularly, her eyes misty as she watched the two friends together. As night fell, Duke mustered enough strength to lift his head and look at Tom with those loyal brown eyes that had watched the hospital doors for 12 years. Tom leaned down close, pressing his forehead against Duke's. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for never giving up on me, for waiting all those years. You're the best friend I could have ever asked for." Duke settled into his bed, curling up just as he had done as a puppy when Tom had first brought him home. The position was so familiar, so reminiscent of those early days, that Tom's throat tightened with emotion. He kept his hand on Duke's back, feeling each slow breath, treasuring every moment as the night grew deeper. The room was quiet except for Duke's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the hospital. Tom stayed awake, his fingers gently stroking Duke's fur, remembering every walk, every game of fetch, every moment they had shared. He watched as Duke's eyes grew heavy, but the old dog fought to keep them open, still watching over his beloved owner just as he had done for so many years. The morning crept into Tom's hospital room with gentle fingers of light. Duke lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, his body curled on the blankets beside Tom's wheelchair. The old veteran hadn't slept, keeping his vigil through the night, his weathered hand never leaving Duke's fur. Hospital staff moved quietly past the door, their footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. Inside the room, time seemed to stand still. Tom leaned closer to Duke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You waited for me, boy. I'll stay with you now." Duke's ears twitched slightly at the sound of Tom's voice. His breathing was labored now, each breath a little slower than the last. Olivia stood in the doorway, her hands clasped together, watching the two friends share their final moments. The morning sun cast warm patches of light across the floor, and Duke stirred slightly. With what seemed like tremendous effort, he lifted his head one last time. His eyes, though clouded with age, found Tom's face. Those brown eyes held the same devotion they had shown every day for 12 years outside the hospital doors. His tail moved against the blanket, once, twice, a final slow wag. Then, as if the effort had taken his last bit of strength, Duke let out a soft sigh and gently laid his head down. His eyes closed and his breathing slowed, then stopped. Tom's hand trembled as he stroked Duke's fur. Tears fell freely down his cheeks as he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Duke's still warm body. "Good boy, Duke," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You were the best boy." The room fell silent. Hospital staff who had gathered in the doorway wiped at their eyes. Olivia stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder as he continued to stroke Duke's fur. Through the window, the morning sun caught the mural on the hospital wall. Duke's faithful vigil captured in paint and color, the words beneath it shimmering in the early light. "Some bonds never break." The hospital corridors felt emptier now, as if Duke's presence had filled more space than his physical form ever could. Tom sat in his wheelchair by the window, his eyes fixed on the corner where Duke's bed used to be. The sunlight fell across the vacant spot, highlighting the indent still visible in the blanket that had been Duke's favorite. Nurses passed by more quietly than usual, their footsteps seeming louder without Duke's gentle breathing to soften them. Even the usual bustle of hospital activity felt muted, as if the building itself was mourning. In the afternoon, a group of veterans gathered in Tom's room. They brought coffee and donuts, but the gesture was more about company than food. Bill, an older veteran who had spent countless mornings sharing his breakfast with Duke, cleared his throat. "That dog got me through some rough patches," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Used to have terrible nightmares, but seeing Duke every morning, so faithful, so steady, it helped me believe things could get better." Another veteran, Sarah, nodded. Remember how he always knew when someone was having a bad day? He'd scoot closer, put his head in their lap. She wiped at her eyes. Didn't matter if he didn't know them. Tom listened, a bittersweet smile playing across his weathered face. Each story revealed a new side of Duke he hadn't known about. How he'd sat with a crying child while their grandfather was in surgery. How he'd helped a patient take their first steps after a stroke by walking slowly beside them. He wasn't just my dog, Tom said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on his armrest. He belonged to all of you too, to this whole place. The afternoon faded into evening, and the veterans drifted away one by one, each sharing a final memory or touching Tom's shoulder before they left. The night settled in, bringing with it a deeper quiet. Tom lay in his hospital bed, the darkness pressing in around him. Out of habit, his hand reached out to the side where Duke would have been. His fingers found only empty space and cold sheets. He drew in a deep breath, feeling the ache in his chest. But he wasn't alone in his grief. The day had shown him that. Duke had left behind more than just memories. He'd created a family of sorts, brought together by his unwavering loyalty and love. Tom could feel their support surrounding him, just as tangible as Duke's presence had been. The morning dawned clear and crisp as hospital staff arranged chairs in the courtyard. White flowers decorated the space where Duke had spent his last days with Tom. People began gathering, nurses still in their scrubs, veterans wearing their service pins, and visitors who had followed Duke's story over the years. The mural of Duke dominated one wall, his painted form forever watchful and loyal. Below it, a growing collection of items appeared. Dog treats, handwritten notes, fresh flowers, and even a few worn tennis balls. Each item told a story of how one dog's dedication had touched so many lives. Tom sat in his wheelchair near the front, his hands folded in his lap. He watched as people approached the mural, some touching it gently, others wiping away tears. The hospital chaplain said a few words about loyalty and love, but Tom barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on Duke's painted face, remembering those final moments together. When it was Tom's turn to speak, Olivia wheeled him closer to the gathered crowd. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. The words stuck in his throat at first, the weight of emotion making it hard to breathe. Then he looked up at the mural, at those familiar eyes that had never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. He found his voice. For years, I didn't know who I was, Tom began, his voice rough but steady. I didn't remember my past, but Duke did. And he waited for me anyway. He paused, swallowing hard. He remembered for both of us. When I couldn't find my way back, he stayed right here, holding my place until I could return. The courtyard was silent except for a few quiet sniffs from the crowd. Tom continued, Duke brought me home, not just to this hospital, but to myself. Every memory he helped me recover, every piece of my life he helped me find, he gave me back who I was. After the final prayers were said and the crowd began to disperse, Olivia stayed behind with Tom. She pulled up a chair beside his wheelchair, her eyes bright with purpose. Duke changed lives, Tom, she said softly. Maybe it's time we do the same. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I've been working on something, a program to pair elderly veterans with senior rescue dogs. Dogs who might be overlooked because of their age, just like Duke was at the shelter. Tom listened as she explained her idea, his eyes still drawn to the mural of his faithful friend. In Duke's painted eyes, he could see the future Olivia was describing, a way to keep Duke's spirit of loyalty and love alive. Tom wheeled through the shelter's narrow hallway, his hands steady on the rims of his chair. The familiar smell of dogs and cleaning supplies filled the air, bringing back memories of when he first met Duke as a puppy. But this time was different. He wasn't here to replace Duke. No one could ever do that. He was here to honor him. Kennels lined both sides of the corridor, each one holding a different story. An old German shepherd watched him pass with dignified eyes. A spotted hound mix wagged his tail hopefully. Most of these dogs were older, their muzzles graying, their movements slower, but their spirits still bright. "These are our senior residents," the shelter worker Sarah explained as she walked beside him. "Most people want puppies or young dogs. These sweethearts often get overlooked." Tom nodded, understanding all too well. He remembered how the shelter had tried to find Duke a new home all those years ago, how they thought an older dog would be easier to place. Then he saw her. In the corner kennel, a Labrador mixed with silver threading through her dark fur sat quietly, watching them approach. She didn't bark or jump like some of the others. Instead, she stood slowly, her tail giving a gentle wag. "What's her story?" Tom asked, wheeling closer to the kennel. Sarah's voice softened. "Her owner had to move into assisted living. Couldn't take her along. She's been here 3 months now. Still has so much love to give, but people keep passing her by." Tom moved his wheelchair as close as he could to the kennel door. The dog approached, her movements careful but graceful. Her eyes met his, warm, gentle, and somehow familiar in their quiet wisdom. "May I?" Tom asked, gesturing to the kennel door. Sarah opened it, and the dog stepped out calmly. She walked right up to Tom's wheelchair and sat beside him, leaning slightly against his leg. The simple gesture made his throat tight. "She's good with the wheelchair," Sarah noted. "Some dogs get nervous, but she seems to understand." Tom reached down, letting his hand rest on the dog's head. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes contentedly. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Duke's passing. The paperwork didn't take long. As Sarah processed the adoption forms, she explained the dog's care routine, her favorite toys, her gentle nature. Tom listened, but his eyes kept drifting to his new companion, who hadn't left his side since leaving the kennel. When everything was signed, Tom wheeled toward the exit, the dog matching his pace perfectly. In the bright sunlight outside the shelter, he paused, looking down at her. Her tail wagged gently, her eyes fixed on him with that same quiet hope. "I think Duke would have liked you," he murmured softly. Her tail wagged faster, and together they headed toward the car, where Olivia waited to drive them home. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside the VA hospital as Tom adjusted his tie. Behind him, his Labrador mix, whom he'd named Hope, sat patiently in her therapy dog vest. The conference room was packed with veterans, shelter representatives, and hospital staff for the launch of Duke's Second Chances. Olivia stood at the podium, her voice clear and strong. "Today, we honor a dog who showed us what unconditional love truly means. Duke waited 12 years for his person to return, and in doing so, he touched countless lives. Now, his legacy will continue through this program." Tom wheeled to the front when it was his turn to speak. Hope followed, her graying muzzle held high. The room fell silent as he began to share his story. The accident, the lost years, and the faithful dog who never gave up on him. "Duke gave me back my memories," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he gave me something even more important. He showed me that it's never too late for a second chance." In the months that followed, the program flourished. Tom visited the hospital 3 times a week, Hope always by his side. They met with veterans who were considering adopting, sharing their own journey of healing and companionship. One morning, Tom watched as an elderly veteran named Frank met his potential match, a senior German shepherd with gentle eyes. The dog approached Frank's wheelchair slowly, then rested his head on the man's lap. Frank's hands trembled as he stroked the dog's fur. "I haven't had a dog since Vietnam," Frank whispered, his eyes misty. "Didn't think I could handle losing another one." Tom wheeled closer, Hope padding alongside him. "These old souls," he said, scratching Hope's ears. "They understand loss too, but they've got so much love left to give." Later that afternoon, Tom sat in his wheelchair before Duke's mural. The painted image of his faithful friend seemed to glow in the late sunlight, the words beneath it as powerful as ever. "Some bonds never break." He reached out, placing his hand on the wall, feeling the texture of the paint where Duke's fur was depicted. "You waited for me, boy," he whispered, his voice soft but steady. "Now it's my turn to take care of them." Hope nudged his arm gently, her tail wagging. Tom chuckled, looking down at his companion. All right, I hear you. Let's go home." He gave the mural one final glance before turning his wheelchair away, Hope matching his pace perfectly as they headed toward the exit. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds, but Tom's heart felt light. Duke's legacy lived on in every wagging tail, every gentle pat, every new beginning that the program made possible. And in that legacy, both veterans and dogs found what they needed most: a second chance at love. The VA hospital's recreation room buzzed with nervous energy. Volunteers led senior dogs of various breeds around the space, while veterans sat in chairs and wheelchairs along the walls. Tom positioned himself near the entrance, Hope lying calmly at his side, watching as the first official Duke's Second Chances pairing event began. "Remember," Olivia announced to the group, "there's no pressure. Just like people, some dogs and veterans click right away. Others take time to warm up." Tom observed as an elderly golden retriever approached a veteran in his 70s. The man's face lit up as he scratched behind the dog's ears. Across the room, a black lab mix curled up at another veteran's feet, both seeming content in each other's company. His attention shifted to a man sitting alone in the corner. Sergeant Bill Carter hadn't spoken more than 2 words since arriving. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor, his whole demeanor suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Tom recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror during his own dark days. A volunteer approached Bill with a German Shepherd mix named Shadow. The dog's face was graying, and he walked with a slight limp. Bill barely glanced up as the volunteer introduced them, his expression remaining distant and closed off. But then something changed. Shadow, instead of seeking attention like some of the other dogs, simply sat down next to Bill's chair. The dog's posture was calm, patient, remarkably similar to how Duke used to sit outside the hospital doors. Bill's eyes flickered toward Shadow, then back to the floor. Shadow didn't move. He didn't bark or whine for attention. He just stayed there, a quiet presence beside the withdrawn veteran. After several minutes, Bill's right hand twitched. Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered it to Shadow's head. The dog leaned slightly into Bill's touch, but maintained his composed demeanor. Tom watched as Bill's fingers began to move, gently stroking Shadow's fur. The veteran's rigid posture softened, just a fraction. "He was a handler," Olivia whispered to Tom, having noticed his interest. "Lost his service dog in Afghanistan. Hasn't connected with another dog since." Tom nodded, understanding the weight of this moment. He remembered his own reconnection with Duke, how a simple touch had unlocked so many memories. As the afternoon progressed, Bill remained in his corner with Shadow. The dog never left his side, and Bill's hand never left the dog's fur. When the volunteer returned with adoption papers, Bill looked up for the first time. His eyes were clearer, more present. He'll need regular walks, the volunteer explained. And he has some arthritis in his back leg. So do I, Bill replied, his voice rough from disuse. He reached for the papers with slightly trembling hands. Tom watched as Bill signed his name on the forms, making Shadow's adoption official. The German Shepherd mix pressed closer to Bill's leg, as if sensing the significance of the moment. For the first time that day, the corners of Bill's mouth turned upward in the ghost of a smile. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Tom's van pulled up to the state-run nursing home. Hope sat quietly beside his wheelchair, her gray muzzle resting on his knee. Olivia had arranged everything, though she'd been surprised by his request to return here. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, helping guide his wheelchair down the ramp. Tom nodded, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. "I need to see it one last time." The building looked exactly as he remembered. Bland beige walls, neat flower beds, and windows that seemed to stare blankly out at the world. A few residents sat in rocking chairs on the front porch, watching with mild interest as Tom's group approached. The administrator welcomed them warmly, remembering Tom from his years there. She led them through familiar hallways that smelled of disinfectant and dried flowers. Tom's room had new occupants now, but that wasn't what he'd come to see. In the courtyard, the old oak tree still stood sentinel, its branches spreading wide over worn wooden benches. Tom asked to be wheeled beneath it. Hope settled beside him, her presence steady and comforting. Sitting there, memories washed over him like gentle waves. He remembered the endless days of staring out windows, feeling lost in his own mind. The frustration of knowing something was missing, but not being able to name it. The fog that had surrounded everything, making the world feel distant and unreal. But now, those empty spaces were filled with understanding. While he had sat here, confused and alone, Duke had been out there, waiting, keeping vigil, never giving up hope that Tom would return. Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal tag. It caught the sunlight, Duke's name gleaming on its surface. With Olivia's help, he moved from his wheelchair to a bench beneath the oak tree. "Could you help me with something?" he asked, holding out the tag. Olivia understood immediately. She took a small trowel from her bag. She'd anticipated this moment and carefully dug a small hole beneath the oak tree. Tom held the tag one last time, running his thumb over Duke's name before placing it gently in the earth. As Olivia covered it with soil, Tom placed his hand on the ground. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Then, straightening his shoulders, he turned away from the tree without looking back. He didn't need to anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital entrance as workers carefully positioned the bronze statue. It was a perfect likeness of Duke, strong, alert, his eyes focused on the sliding glass doors just as they had been for all those years. The sculpture captured him in his prime, before age had taken its toll, his posture radiating both patience and determination. Hospital staff gathered around, many wiping tears from their eyes as they remembered the real Duke who had occupied that very spot. The bronze plaque beneath the statue gleamed in the morning light. For Duke, the dog who never left, a symbol of loyalty, love, and second chances. Tom sat in his wheelchair in the front row, Hope lying quietly beside him. His fingers traced the engraved letters of Duke's name, feeling each curve and line. Olivia stood nearby, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The crowd grew as veterans arrived, many accompanied by their own rescue dogs from the Duke's Second Chances program. Even strangers who had read about Duke's story in the papers came to pay their respects. Some brought flowers, others left small dog treats at the base of the statue. A touching gesture, even if the bronze Duke couldn't eat them. When the hospital director asked Tom to say a few words, he wheeled himself to the front. The microphone felt heavy in his hands, but his voice was steady as he spoke. "He waited for me," Tom said simply, his eyes meeting those of the Bronze Duke. "And now, I hope this reminds everyone to never give up on the ones who love them." The words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. Several people in the crowd nodded, understanding the depth of meaning behind the short statement. As the ceremony wound down and the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the statue, Hope nudged Tom's leg gently. He looked down at her gray muzzle and kind eyes, chuckling as he scratched behind her ears. "All right, let's go, girl," he said softly. Tom took one final look at Duke's statue, its bronze surface catching the last rays of sunlight. Then he turned his wheelchair toward the hospital exit, Hope padding faithfully beside him. For the first time in years, his heart felt truly at peace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital entrance as Olivia Carter stepped outside, smoothing her white coat. After 15 years as head of the VA hospital, these quiet moments still reminded her of Duke and the legacy he had created. She watched as a young veteran approached the entrance, his steps hesitant and uneven. His service jacket hung loosely on his frame, and beside him trotted an older golden retriever, gray around the muzzle but with alert, gentle eyes. The dog matched his pace perfectly, occasionally glancing up at him with quiet concern. The veteran's hands fidgeted with his sleeves as he drew closer to the entrance. His shoulders were tense, his expression uncertain, a look Olivia had seen countless times before. The weight of walking through those doors could feel overwhelming for many veterans. But then he stopped, his attention caught by Duke's statue. The bronze figure stood proud and watchful, just as the real Duke had for all those years. The veteran stepped closer, his dog following faithfully. His fingers traced the inscription, moving slowly over each letter. The tension in his shoulders began to ease as he read the words. He glanced down at his own dog, who sat patiently beside him, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Running his hand over the statue's bronze fur, the veteran seemed to draw strength from Duke's eternal vigilance. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and looked toward the hospital entrance with new determination. With his companion close by his side, the veteran walked through the sliding glass doors, his steps more confident than before. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the warmth of spring. Sunlight caught the edges of Duke's statue, making the bronze gleam as if alive. The program had touched so many lives, bringing together lonely souls who needed each other most. Duke's legacy wasn't just a memory set in bronze. It lived on in every partnership formed, and every life changed. The light shifted, highlighting once more the words that had inspired so many. For Duke, the dog who never left, a symbol of loyalty, love, and second chances. If you enjoyed the story of Tom and Duke, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.